Patti Smith here on Democracy Now! Without Chains. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over 750 stations, on Pacifica and NPR stations, low-power FM, college and community radio stations, on public access TV and PBS TV stations, and both TV satellite networks, on Dish Network, channel 9415 Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and on DirecTV, channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines are also available in Spanish for any radio station to take, as over 200 are, and your station can too, just ask. We're talking to, well, he's calling himself Matthew Alexander. His book is How to Break a Terrorist, the U.S. interrogators who use brains, not brutality, to take down the deadliest man in Iraq. And in a moment, we'll also be joined by a man who has taken on the issue of torture for years now, Scott Horton, an attorney specializing in international law and human rights, legal affairs contributor to Harper's Magazine. He writes the blog No Comment. We'll talk with him in just 1 minute. But Matthew Alexander, focusing on, well, you did over 300 interrogations yourself. You supervised over 1,000. But the key person who provided the information, the whereabouts of Zarqawi, you said you moved from fear to this next approach, and explain it.
Yes, the man who ultimately led us to Zarqawi, I call Abu Haider in the book. And Abu Haider was an interesting character. He was the Hannibal Lecter, if you will, of al-Qaeda. He had the same appearance and the same sort of general demeanor. The way he talked was very similar. He was a grand egoist. He enjoyed having his ego stroked, and he wanted to believe that he was a man of power and influence. And so instead of trying to tear that down, which is a technique that we tried, or some interrogators tried prior to my interrogation of him, I decided to build rapport with him and to stroke his ego and to build him up. And what I ended up developing during one 6-hour interrogation was a very strong relationship with him of trust. And I believe he trusted me because we spoke extensively about the Quran, which I've read, and I showed respect for his beliefs and his religion. And I showed respect for the Sunni Iraqi cause in Iraq and how difficult it was after our invasion. And
he was from Iraq.
He was from Iraq. He was an Iraqi. He had worked in the government prior to our arrival in Iraq, and he had lost his job. And this is another thing that you can get out of my book that you're not going to hear anywhere else, is you're going to hear the voice of Iraqis, the Sunnis who joined al-Qaeda, and you can hear the reasons why they joined, which you can't read anywhere else. You know, our government tells you that, or we have said in the past, that all the Sunnis that joined the insurgency were extremists. And that's not the case. You can hear the voices of Iraqi Sunnis talking about the variety of reasons why they joined. Some were economic, some were social, some were tribal affiliation. A large number of Sunni Iraqis joined the insurgency because they needed protection from the Shia militias that we had allowed to run loose when we disbanded the government.
And their feelings about Saddam Hussein?
You know, the Sunni Iraqis that I interrogated had no love for Saddam. They despised him. A lot of them were Ba'ath Party members simply because you had to be a Ba'ath Party member to have a job in Iraq under Saddam. And they were glad to see him gone. But at the same time, they were very concerned about their access to future oil and wealth and how were they going to feed their families. And so many of them had joined al-Qaeda in an effort to try and establish some type of Sunni power in Iraq post-Saddam.
And what did they say about Zarqawi?
Well, you know, a lot of them, although they had many of them had participated or in some way influenced or helped Zarqawi with his campaign of suicide bombings, the large majority of them did not believe in his ideology. Let me give you the case of one of the guys that I interrogated early on. His name was Abu Ali, and he was an imam. And he had joined the insurgency because one of his best friends had been killed by a Shia militia, and he turned to al-Qaeda for protection. He, at one point, even blessed suicide bombers. But, you know, in the end, he told me, he said, Matthew, I don't believe in this, in bombing Shia civilians. My mother is Shia. Iraqis have a long history of intermarriage between Sunni and Shia, but we've been forced in this situation because of the Shia militias. And so we have to do this to protect ourselves.
So how you extracted the actual information for where Zarqawi was. So Bush believed that Zarqawi was responsible for the UN bombing also?
He was. Zarqawi was responsible for a number of bombings. Even when he wasn't directly planning things, he obviously was directing or inspiring others to exact his campaign of targeting civilians. The man who ultimately led us to Zarqawi, Abu Haider, he ultimately turned on Zarqawi because he rejected his ideology of extremism, and also because I promised him a new way ahead, a way in which Americans could work together with Sunni Iraqis. We could find middle ground to negotiate, to compromise, and work together to battle against these types of extremists. And Abu Haider ultimately rejected Zarqawi and decided that it was best for the future of Iraq if Zarqawi was dead.
How long did this take?
Well, the interrogation, he was scheduled to leave the prison where I was at, and I had about 6 hours to sit down with him and convince him to give us some information. And it wasn't until the last 30 minutes before he was supposed to get on a helicopter that I was able to convince him to work together with us and to sell out his cause.
Where were they going to take him?
He would have been transferred to another prison, either Abu Ghraib or one of the other prisons.
Where were you?
I can't say the exact location where I was. Yeah.
And so in that last 30 minutes, well, then he had more time with you.
Yeah, you know, I tell in the story, the book, of this last 30 minutes because, you know, I could hear the clock ticking in my head, and I knew this man could lead us to Zarqawi.
How did you know that?
I knew it because I'd been watching him, monitoring his interrogations for a few weeks, and I guess it was a gut feeling, you know, it was intuition.
Where had he been picked up?
He had been picked up in a house with suicide bombers during a raid. There was 5 men captured in the house, and my team interrogated those 5 men. And the suicide bombers had been killed in the house by our soldiers during a very exciting, daring raid, I should say. And he had pretended for a long time that he was there accidentally. He was supposed to have come to film a wedding, which obviously was a lie. But it was obvious to me from watching him over a period of weeks that this was a very important person and that he had to have been very close to the higher echelons of al-Qaeda.
And so those last 30 minutes? Those
last 30 minutes, I decided to take a gamble. I decided to take a risk, which is part of interrogations is risk-taking and not being afraid to lay it out on the line. And so during those last 30 minutes, I told him that I already knew that he was close to somebody and that if he would provide me the name of that person and show me that he trusted me, that I could help him. And I actually had no particular person in mind. It was a ruse. But he believed me, and he told me that he was friends with Abu Ayyub al-Masri, who is now the current leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, and who was Zarqawi's right-hand man.
And so what information did he give up then, where he was? Well,
eventually, at that point, we had just been able to establish that he was in the higher echelon. It took us a period of weeks after that, about 2 weeks, to get him to admit that he was friends with Zarqawi's personal spiritual advisor, who was Sheikh Abu Abdul Rahman, who is the person who led us to Zarqawi. But he told us not only who Rahman was, but how to find Rahman and how we would know when he went to meet with Zarqawi.
And where was Rahman?
Rahman was in Baghdad, in his home, and you know, he was actually a coordinator of events also for Zarqawi. He was a spiritual advisor. Zarqawi used Iraqi imams like Abu Haider and like Rahman to try to legitimize his suicide bombings against Shia civilians. And in exchange, these people got money and arms from al-Qaeda. So that was his way of legitimizing what he was doing.
Why was it a risk to say you would help him if he turned in someone important?
It's a risk because it's very hard to make that come true. At the time that I was in Iraq, we had no program to reach out to Sunnis and to literally work with them. We could promise them that, and certainly if they cooperated with us when they went before a panel of judges later for sentencing, they would look favorably on their cooperation. However, we had no program like they have now that General Petraeus put in place to reach out to Sunnis and to arm them and to physically work together with him.